thanks very much for joining us, Paul. Can you tell us a little bit about how your business coped with the initial lockdown and what measures you introduced as a result of that back in March?
Yeah, so we actually had a really tricky period for our business back in August, September last year. So we moved our warehouse with the aim of, and we achieved that, of reducing massively our carbon impact, 47% decrease in carbon. That was the reason for the move. Yet everything went horribly wrong. So the move went wrong. It was like a perfect storm. Everything you could think of that possibly went wrong. So we had at least 2 months of hell, really. Terrible customer, we're giving customers awful service. There was stuff coming into the warehouse, not getting put away in time. Orders were going out late. So it's a really, really tricky time, but we knew we'd done it for the right reasons. So there was a tremendous togetherness and a tremendous resilience, I think, that we built up as a company in 2019. And I do think, just reflecting back on it now, I do think that kind of put us in a good place to deal with what 2020 has thrown at us. So obviously, as everyone else did back in March, we moved everyone, all but two, actually. 2 people have stayed here during the whole time for, there's loads of space here, so that's fine. And we do get quite a lot of deliveries coming in here. And everyone else moved home. Now, probably 60% of those that work in the office have never worked at home before. So that was an interesting challenge. We had IT challenges. We get in about 800 phone calls a week into this office. So fortunately for us, in February, we changed our phone system. So we're with one now, and it had a disaster recovery option that if our offices burnt down, we could farm out all the phone calls to mobile phones. So that's pretty much what we've been doing. We've been in disaster recovery for 6 months. So all our inbound phone calls all get siphoned out to people's individual mobile numbers. And it's worked really well. We've done around 50% more business during the pandemic, and that's purely due to the fact we're in the food and drink industry. And we've done that with the same number of people we had before. So that probably means that we've been a lot more productive, I would imagine.
Has the experience in the last 6 months then changed your view of how the business operates in any way?
Yes, I mean, I'm probably a bit of a slow learner here, because for the last 21 years, which is the life of the business, I have always worked in a split week. So and initially those was purely due to looking after my 4 children, which I did 2 days a week. So those 2 days a week I worked at home, and 3 days a week in the office. So and that's worked really well for me. And then what I've been a bit slow to do is just to realise actually that model probably would work well for other people too. So while some people have done that, and our sales team are all field-based, they work from home. Most people in the office haven't done that, and that's very much the model that we're now moving to. I mean, I think we want to do it anyway, but that's what people want to do. They've enjoyed seeing their kids a bit more. They've realised they can be productive doing that. At the same time, there is a mental health and, there is an isolation factor as well, which needs to be borne in mind. So I think there is I'm not into these companies that are going to get rid of their office and everyone works from home forever. I do think you need to be together some of the time, but we're going to move to a model where people are here around half the time. So they'll have some time, physical time with their teams, and then also have days of the week when they work at home. That's the plan.
Thinking about that a wee bit more, Paul, I found when we were organising the Sustainable Business Conference that when you mentioned sustainability, people's default position was usually that you were talking about recycling. Do you think that view of sustainability has shifted in people's heads a little bit during this pandemic, in the sense that people have now realized that there are more strands to this, and your people and mental health and all those sort of people challenges are probably now being thought of a little bit more in businesses than maybe they were before.
Yes, I think you're right. I think sustainability, I'm not sure about recycling, but it's definitely been more skewed towards the environmental side. Now, sustainability for me is a much broader term than that. It isn't sustainable for company CEOs like the supermarkets in the UK to be paid more in a day than the people who stack the shelves get paid in a whole year. That's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for society in general, and I don't think it is now sustainable for those businesses. So I think businesses that carry on operating in the old style model of capitalism, I do think they're going to struggle. And I think the businesses that put reversing injustice, put equality, put the environment first above profits, or at least at the same level, are going to be the businesses that will be here. And the ultimate meaning of the word sustainability is actually they'll be here in 10, 20 years' time, isn't it? So, yes, I think that things have changed massively. I think that we no longer need to kind of preach the message that planet and people are important, and that businesses that only put shareholders first isn't a good thing. You don't need to say that anymore. I think people now realize that the whole extreme capitalism model that's got more and more extreme really since the 1980s is no longer sustainable. So it's a much easier, I think the conference now, whenever you do it, will probably have more people there, because now a lot more people know that this really is the only way to go for, if you're going to have a successful business, you've got to be sustainable in the broadest sense of that word.
You make an interesting point there about sustainability being more important. We had a conversation with a few people connected to the event over the last while who work in the sustainability space. And their experience over the last 6 months has been very mixed, in that some companies, they've noticed, and some organizations, the knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic was almost the sustainability stuff all got parked. Because there were seen to be other priorities, like cash in the bank, for example. Whereas other companies have decided it was the right time to, given that there was now potentially a little bit more space than they had during the busy period, that now was the time to actually accelerate this. Have you noticed that divergence really in terms of how different companies have approached this since the pandemic?
Yes, I think for sure there has been a distinct polarization going on. And I think one thing that has happened during the pandemic is that it's been more obvious which the good companies are and which the bad companies are. And I won't name any names here, but we've all seen the news headlines, and we can all think of companies that have behaved absolutely appallingly during the pandemic. And at the same time, companies like Airbnb, for example, have behaved incredibly well. They made a load of people redundant, but they paid for their healthcare for the following year. They gave them all their company laptops, and they've got a team helping those people get work. So you have got this polarization going on. And yes, I've also heard what you just said about companies need to forget all that sustainable stuff and concentrate on making money again. But the implication with that is, if you don't focus on environmentalism as a company, or rather if you do focus on environmentalism as a company, you'll make less profit. That's not true. Most companies I know that are very good on the environmentalism side are actually the most successful ones, and consumers want to buy products from those companies. They don't want to buy products from companies that are treating the planet as a dispensable asset. They want to buy companies that are doing the planet good. And that, I do feel, it's not everyone yet, but it's a lot more people than it was in the beginning of 2020. So as time goes on, I do think consumers will vote with their feet and will things will change. It won't happen overnight, but I do think things will change over the next months and years.
Going back to your experience over the last 6 months of the pandemic, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the biggest personal lesson that you've learned has been over the last 6 months?
Yeah, so I think probably I've realised I mean, I do love travelling. I've probably done some unnecessary travelling, which will change for good. Um, I've always been the kind of person that spends some time in quiet and reflection at home and goes for walks. But I've certainly appreciated where I live a lot more than I did before. You know, we've actually discovered about 10 new walks from our house. It's criminal actually that we hadn't walked enough in the area that we live in. And as with many other people, we've actually got to know many people in the village a lot better than we knew before. So that's been a tremendous thing. And I think the whole community side of things, and I actually with the government now is telling people to report their neighbours if they're meeting more than groups of 6, which seems to be an attempt to almost destroy that community that's built up over the last few months. So that would be a shame if we went back from that. I don't think it will. I think people have realised how isolated they were in their towns and villages and cities, and the facts are that human beings are a community mammal. But in the West, we've not lived like that. They do in developing countries. They're far better at this than us. So I think we've rediscovered the fact that we are community mammals, that we need other people to function properly as human beings, and we've rediscovered relationships and friendships, which is obviously a fantastic thing for the future.
That sort of connects up nicely with what I wanted to wrap up with the last question, I suppose, Paul. You know, and we've had a conversation before. I use the term sort of forced back into the local community because of an unwillingness to go and stand in queues at major supermarkets, largely. And then the Club for Carers, I find myself talking to neighbours. I mean, as you said, it's criminal. I've lived in this street for 15 years, and there are people who live 3 and 4 houses down from me who I had never spoken to. Mm. And that initial Club for Carers was great in that it allowed us back into those communities again. I suppose the next question is, do you think that those changes in behaviour will last? Or will the cynical view that we're all animals of convenience, and as soon as we're able to slip back into those easy routines, that a lot of the good things that have happened over the last 6 months will be forgotten about?
Yes, I do, but I do think there's a inequality here as well. In fact, I heard a phrase which has stuck with me in the early part of the pandemic, that there's a new working class, and it's those who can't work at home. I think that's quite a profound comment, because there are people who are lucky enough to be able to flex and spend more time at home, work at home, see their families, but there are also many, many people who don't have that luxury. So I think that is almost, you need to do something about the inequality side before we can properly answer that question. So undoubtedly, I mean, we supply local shops in our business, and I do know many more people have been shopping locally during the pandemic. And I do think that will carry on, because I think people have realised that actually they'd rather support a local business where if they make a profit, the profit might be helping the guy who owns the shop send his kids to university or pay for his young daughter's horse riding lesson, and rather than shopping at those big multiples where the CEOs are getting paid far too much and the institutional shareholders are what's driving the business. So I think where people have are able to make the choice, then that will remain. But we also need to do something about the inequality and help people who aren't in a privileged position to be able to make that choice make it as well.
are you more or less positive about the future of your business, given the experience of the last 6 months?
Yeah, well, I think we've, you mentioned B Corp earlier in the conversation. So we've been a company that puts people and planet, ahead of profit for 5 years. It has had no real commercial benefit for us. It's obviously not why we did it. We do it because we believe in it. But it's had no sales advantage or marketing advantage for us as a company. Now, the pandemic people are shopping more locally. We're 50% up on our turnover, and there's reasons. The reasons for that are the community issues we're talking about. But I do get the sense that more retailers are thinking more carefully about who they're buying from, what's the carbon impact of how they're buying the goods to fill their shops. And that also applies to B2C businesses as well. I do think there will be more people that think about what they're buying. And I do think people will buy less as well, actually, but they'll spend perhaps more on the things they buy. They get better quality things, and that applies to food, it applies to other areas as well. I think people have realized the emptiness of consumerism to some degree, and this was happening anyway. This happened last Christmas, noticeably. I heard a number of people say, oh, we're not doing presents this year. We're just going to give some money to charity. Even my dad, who's kind of grown up in a very consumerist world through the 70s, 80s, 90s, were saying things like that. So I do think there's been a shift. So I do think we're at the early stages of this, but I do think things have changed. I do think the pandemic has changed us as a nation and even as a planet, and things will never quite be the same afterwards.
What advice would you give to an organisation that was committed to B Corp or even internally committed to making themselves more sustainable? I suppose, given your experience with Cotswold Fayre, what would you say to them to make sure that they stick with it, if you like, and are in it for the duration?
Yeah, it's a great question with potentially many big answers. I think the thing that has changed has been people's intention. So I think generally more people now intend to do business better. However, you can get some of the way with intention. That's how we first became a B Corp. But I think to perpetuate what you're doing and to make sure that culture is truly embedded in a business, it does involve personal change as well. And I don't think you can separate that. In the book I wrote, Forces for Good, I only intended that to be about 3 sections: people, planet, and actually if you do those 2 things well, you'll also make more profit. That was it, end of book. As I was writing it though, I realized actually we can't do this without a degree of personal change. And so there's a 4th section in the book, which I call my 4th bottom line. And I haven't really got a word for it. Certainly not one beginning with P, but it's about, well, personal change, I suppose, begins with P. But I think we'll run out of energy unless we are becoming people that are able to love others more. Unless we become people that have more compassion, both for people, the poor of the world, and the planet, I don't think the movement won't be sustainable. So it does concern me a bit that you've now got a lot of big companies certifying as B Corps, which is fantastic. Great news, don't get me wrong. But unless within those companies, people are also changing personally and changing to be people of compassion and people with heart, I do think the movement may run out of steam. So, and interestingly enough, the things I've, since I wrote the book and published it, the things I've been asked to talk about most is actually that personal change element, because people like me, CEOs of businesses don't really talk about this stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's, and one of the reasons we haven't got it actually as a bit of a sideline, is that there've been too many men in leadership positions. Men generally aren't as good as women at empathy, love, and compassion. Let's face it. So more women in leadership positions is essential, in my view. In fact, I've got a talk I do called "The Future of Leadership is Feminine." That's not just about women being in leadership; it is that, but it's also about men becoming, getting in touch with their feminine side, if you want to use that expression. And I think that's happening. And I think that the reaction of various governments during the pandemic has almost emphasised that as well, because the countries led by women have generally done a better job of looking after their people than the countries led by men who are erring on the side of machismo. Won't mention any names, but we know who they are. So yes, I do think there's been a tidal change on that front too. And the thing that's really on my heart now is to kind of get that personal change into leaders. In fact, I have written another book during lockdown, which I haven't done anything with yet, but it's basically about 50 characteristics of good leadership. And, there's chapters on empathy, on compassion, on self-discipline, and on lots of, and actually looking through the list, a lot of them are the more feminine qualities that have been desperately lacking in the leadership that we've seen over the past 50, 100 years of business.
Thanks for joining us today for that episode of Lockdown Lessons, and obviously we'll see you whenever, if and when we're able to confirm a date for the Sustainable Business Conference in Belfast. We look forward to seeing you there, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of engagement with the content that you'll be delivering there. So thanks again, Paul, and we'll talk to you again soon.